Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We're getting close to the end of our study on Moses. We're getting close. We're in Deuteronomy 34 today. What's the difference between an obituary and a eulogy?
Obituary talks about facts, eulogies, facts.
Okay, the obituary is written. Eulogy is spoken.
That was easy.
And so I have one here. This was the program for when my uncle was my mom's brother that just passed away, and who spoke here. Do you remember about 10 years ago when he spoke? And they have both here. They have an obituary which his son gave, and then they'll have like reflections by a brother. Okay, that'd be a eulogy. Reflections by a brother-in-law, that'd be a eulogy. Reflections by a son, would be a eulogy. And then you have obituary, which they have 2 pages on here. It's kind of interesting reading the obituary that his son wrote, and the younger son, and my cousin anyway, when I was reading it, it was kind of interesting when he said, my dad only got angry one time that I know of in my entire life. And the other older brother said, well, it was the second time he got mad at me. But I'm thinking, can you imagine 50-something years you only remember your dad getting mad twice? Wow. My kids have probably said twice in 1 week.
Twice in the same day.
But when you think about it today, we're going to be, if you wanted the title, be being called home, calling Moses home. You know, it's without any fanfare, which was that God had designed. When he calls him home. When we study it, I think we can learn something about it. Next week, we'll look at the legacy of Moses. And I think you can learn a lot as well. A lot of people are wanting to leave a legacy or whatever about it. And you think about it kind of preempting what next week, but you stop and think, how much possessions did Moses give his 2 sons? Did he give them any? What did he have to give them? Was he in the promised land? He had no land to give them, no money to give them. What did he have to give them? But how many people consider Moses one of the greatest men to ever live? What did Jesus have to give so far as material possessions? So I think often when you think about legacy, there's a lot more than just material things. So we're looking at it in Deuteronomy chapter 34. And if you think about it in Deuteronomy 34, when Moses is writing, or being written about him, you notice it has first of all the viewing of the promised land. And then Moses goes up to the plains of Moab, to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah. Okay, we all read that, don't think much about it. How tall is that? How tall is that mountain? It's 4,500 feet. How old is Moses? 120?
Oh, yeah.
How many 90-year-olds are going to walk up almost a mile? Now you stop and you think about it. We read this and we don't think about it. You also, God says, it's your day, I'm going to take you. How many of you are going to get up and say, okay, I'm going to die today. All right, Lord, here I'm coming up to die. I mean, you stop and you think about the obedience. And just when you look at this, the place, like I said, I just gave you the place. And the reason for it is all the way back, if you remember, in Numbers 20 and Numbers 27. If you remember when God told him to speak to the rock and he strikes the rock out of disbelief. which he had struck before, and God given him water. And therefore God said he couldn't enter the land. So notice, if you look at it, this panoramic view, if you look at the rest of it in verse 1 down to verse 4, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the plains of Jericho all the way as far as Zorah. You think about it, that's amazing. God was able to give him the ability to look over all of Israel. God allowed him to see it all. Now, how many of you would be upset with God if he says, all right, I'm going to show you everything, but you don't get to go in? You stop and think about it. I think there's a lot of things we can look at, the panoramic view, but what about the view of our promise? Look at it that way. Has God promised us things? 2 Corinthians 5, to be absent from the body is to be present where? How encouraging is that to you to know the future promise? To know where you're going or know where a loved one's at? What about you have the same thing in John 14? You let not your heart be troubled, believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and if I were not so, I would have told you. Then what does he say? I go and prepare what? That where I am, there ye may be what? How encouraging is that? Panoramic view. Give us a little bit of glimpse of the future. Or what about 1 Corinthians 15? You know, we're going to be changed in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye. We're going to be raised imperishable with the perfect body, just like Christ, the feast of first fruits earlier in the chapter. That's panoramic. How many of us, we hear it, how many times do you hear those verses at a funeral? Why are we giving the people that view? To encourage. The same thing can be encouraging to you and I. You think about it with Moses, his whole responsibility was to shepherd. He brought for 40 years, he's brought these people, shepherding them all the way here to give them this land. I've often wondered, maybe you have, I don't know, if he hadn't have committed that particular sin, God allowed him to go in, how long would he have been there and what before God called him home? Can you imagine a general, 120 years old, all right, charge, you know? You don't know. But I think it's important for us to look at these promises that you have. So here he takes him this far. Notice in verse 4, I think it's interesting. So he tells him where he's going up to the mountain. And again, that's quite a ways to go up. It's, you know, I'm sure they had nice paved paths going up it and all the rest of this. And he gets up and he goes, obedient. And notice in verse 4, I think that's interesting, the promise that you have. Then Abraham said, to this land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He swore it in Genesis 12 to Abraham, Genesis 26 to Isaac, and Genesis 28 to Jacob. You think about how many years earlier was that? They were in Egypt 430 years. God keeps his promise. A lot of times we wished he'd go a little faster about some of the promises. But God does keep his promise. So notice it's interesting, the promise that you have. The prohibition now is in verse 4 also. At the end of it. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. How tempting would it have been to disobey? How tempting would it have been? You have to give Moses credit. God showed it to him and God told him no, and he was obedient. And I think it's interesting, we have prohibitions that we are told things we're to do and told not to. And if you remember, he prayed 3 times that were recorded. Moses prays to God to allow him to go in. You know, admits his guilt, tells him to go in, but there are consequences. And there's consequences to all of us. We have consequences. David, God forgave him, but he had to pay the penalty. You know, 4-fold basically. Peace, we never had peace again, and it included his family. So you think about it, the prohibition, but you stop and you think about it, just some things to ponder when you look at it. he's called home early. And the reason I say that, we'll go back to it in a minute, but notice in verse 7, it's an amazing statement. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. So he's 120, and he's just like he was when he was 40. So you realize why he had no trouble climbing the mountain? How many of you at 60 can see like you could when you were 30? How many of you want to do, so you think about it, God gave him the incredible. He did the same thing with Caleb. You remember Caleb at 85 say, I'm as strong today as what I was. God gave those two men an incredible, their body didn't age like the others. He gave them that incredible. So when you stop and think about it, look over with me for 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We will have the Lord's Supper in a couple of weeks, but look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Okay, we're told to take the Lord's Supper. Obviously, we're to do this in remembrance of Him, and it's a remembering and a proclamation. But notice also in verse 28 of 1 Corinthians 11, but let each man examine himself, so that let him eat the bread and drink the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you are asleep or have died. Why have they died? Because there was sin in their life and they didn't address it, and they took the Lord's Supper. And I think it's important to stop and think about that, because all of us have to deal with different things in our life that we have to address. God's gracious. If God killed us or did something every time one of us sinned, how many of us would be here today? And so it's fine. So what happens a lot of times, think, well, nothing happened. I'm not sick. So everything's okay. And we don't address whatever it might be. So I think it's important for us to realize there comes a time when God says that's enough. He can call you home early. And it can be, sickness can be because of a lot of other things. Sin's just only one of them. If you remember who sinned, this man, or in John 4, or his parents, and there's neither one of us to bring glory to God. It can simply be the result of sin nature. We have passed down different genes that we have, good or bad. It has different things. But I want us to think about, though, he is called home, but he's called home early. Because I think it's interesting. What does it tell us over in Psalms 139? Psalms 139 is an interesting, David's writing. In verse 16. It talks about your frame and everything being formed in your mother's womb in 15. Notice in 16. Thy eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in thy book they were written. The days were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. Does God have a time frame for you? Does He have a time frame for me? He does. But we can be called home early if we don't address things. So I think it's important for all of us, since God has allowed all of us to be here, what does that mean? Does He have something for you to do? John the Baptist. How old was John the Baptist when he got called home? If Jesus was 33, John the Baptist would have to have been what? Okay, remember he was 6 months older, but he was called before Christ did, so he'd be less than that. You think about it. I mean, and he had tremendous abilities and things, and God called him home. His ministry was complete. He prepared the way. God called him home. And you think about it, one of the great missionaries Jim Elliot, if you remember, he was just young in his 20s. In 1955, when he went down he and the other 4 men to try to witness and lead the tribe to Christ. And word had gotten out, and if you look at the history, they were told, the tribesmen were told that they were after the women. Obviously that was not the case. And they killed him. And Jim Elliot in his pocket had a gun. But they all had made an agreement among the 5 of them. We won't use it because we know where we're going if we die, and we know where they're going. If they die without Christ, we know where they're going. It's an amazing statement when you stop and think about it, but one of his big goals, Jim Elliot's big goals, was he wanted to stimulate and get more people to go to the mission field. You realize that particular incident when it became national news and everything else, how many people went to the mission field because of it? It's amazing too, 2 of the women, obviously the wives, then go back and led much of the tribe to Christ. In fact, the one that killed her husband, the son led to Christ. Amazing when you think about just the grace. But being called home, why would God take him home? We don't know. That's why God's ways are not our ways, God's thoughts are not ours. But when it talks about being called, we all will be, but let's be called home at the right time, not because there's sin in our life that we want to address. And I think that's an important thing to stop and think about, to ponder. You had the Exodus 4. Did God almost take Moses before he ever got started on his ministry? Remember God in Exodus 3, I want you to lead the children of Israel. While he's going back, God then went to kill him because he didn't do the circumcision. He wasn't being obedient, and his wife rescued him. You think about here, the man that God has exactly designed to do the job, but he's not being obedient. God said, hey, I can get somebody else. And his wife helps him. I think a lot of times we think we're so important, God can get somebody else. But if he's left us here, there's a reason why he has us here. Are we going to serve him while we're here? So think about it. Here you have the viewing of the promise. So how serious do I view my sin? Is there something that I need to confess? I think a lot of times we look at our sin, and the reason we think it's okay is what? I look at so-and-so, and they're a whole lot worse than me. I look at them, they're a whole lot worse than me. We just need to look at ourselves and look at our Savior. Notice then me being called home in verse 4, we saw that he's going to be called home. And notice it's interesting when you do this in verse 5. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. Pretty simple, isn't it? One of the greatest heroes of your nation, and you go up, Lord takes you. Just like God said he would. By the way, isn't he going to call all of us home according to his word? He'll call all of us. And I think it's interesting, how many of us would have climbed the mountain if you knew when you get to the top, that's it? He obediently went. I think it's amazing that he did. Jesus basically said what? Lord, take this cup, and not my will, but what? Thine be done. It's interesting. Why do you think in verse 6, he, God, buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day? Why do you think nobody knows? Why did God make it a secret?
So they wouldn't worship him.
There you go. So they wouldn't worship him. If they knew the location, do you think there would have been any type of tourist attraction even today? And how much money would you pay to go up on the rock and basically see it? God did not want the hero worship. He didn't want that. And therefore nobody knows. General location, but nobody knows. The same thing happened, if you remember, in Judges 8. Remember Gideon leads the people and goes against the Midianites, and they're able to be spared. And then the Israel wants to make him king, and Gideon says, no, you will not make me king, nor my son, but you all can give me some earrings, some stuff, some gold. And what does he make out of it? He makes an ephod out of it, and it says in verse 28 of chapter of it, chapter 8, 27, that it became a snare to him. Whatever he made out of it, we don't know, but it became like an idol and became a snare to him and to the people. And so it can be easy. Any one of us, God can help any one of us, but we can easily get caught up into that type of thing. But God didn't. And I think it's interesting why he didn't. So we've seen the promised land. He got to see it. You and I get to see a little bit about what our future is going to be. You look at the things in Revelation 21, 22, it looks like a pretty nice place. How about you? And you like seeing those gates and walking on those streets and all the rest of that. But also he gets called home. Notice the grieving that you have in verse 8. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now I think it's important. There's a place for grieving. And grieve for 30 days in mourning. And I think it's important. Everybody grieves differently. And how many times have you been to places, especially if there's guys or young men or whatever, and what are you so often told? Don't cry. Men don't cry. Did Jesus cry? Jesus wept, and he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he still wept. And so I think it's important. The duration and the manner in which it's done will vary from person to person. So we need to allow that to take place. But I think it's interesting. It's duration, the manner, and so on is interesting. Hebrews 9:27 says, "It's appointed unto man to die, and after that's the judgment." We're all going to die, unless the rapture takes place. But for the most part, most of us are going to die. And as we look in the mirror, some of it's getting a little closer than some of the others. Well, when you think about, you stop and you think about it, look at the very first, just turn your page over, just one over to Joshua chapter 1. Notice in verse 1 and 2. Now it came about that after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun. Moses, servant, says, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people of the land which I'm giving to them, to the sons of Israel." The reason I mention that, I think it's important. There's a time for grief, but God's work still goes on. God called his man home, Moses, but God has a replacement, Joshua, and the work goes on. And I think it's easy sometimes for us just to stop. We grieve and that's it. We don't do anymore. And I think it's important to notice the work continues. If you go to verse 9, remember this would be basically from last week's message. It talks about the replacement or filling his shoes. If you notice back in 34 and verse 9, Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom. For Moses had laid his hands on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded him. Notice it's interesting, he was given the ability when. Notice he was filled with the Spirit. Moses laid his hands on him. He got the ability to do it when it was time. When it's time to do the job that God wants you to do, he'll give you the ability if you rely on it. It's also interesting, he was acknowledged by Moses. How important was it for the people to see Moses say, "Here's my replacement"? And he also gave him responsibilities. Before Moses left, Joshua already had responsibilities that he was fulfilling that the people could see. And that's so important, to being able to give that. How many of us you just ever stop and think about, what about Titus chapter 3? Older women teach younger women. How often do you all see that? How many times you've reached retirement? Does that mean your work stops? The Lord's left you on this earth. Now you may not do something full time, you may not do this, your ministries may change, but you still have something to do. How open are we to be taught, and how open are we to help share our knowledge with other people? And obviously they're doing that. It's also interesting that people accepted it. I think a lot of times we are too scared to relinquish. Why? Why do we want to keep our hands on everything even though we know we're retiring or we know whatever may happen? Maybe they'll do it better than you. Maybe they won't do it the way you do it. And I can assure you they won't do it exactly the way you do it. They have different gifts, different abilities. And you can find that's true with anything. You can still be successful doing it a different way. And so I think it's important. It's the Holy Spirit is moving Joshua. The Holy Spirit moved Moses. I think it's interesting. So thinking ahead, how many of you are planning ahead? You know, I'm not one that plans a lot in advance. It's Gene that drives her nuts. In my family, Ruthie and others, they want to plan, you know, every day. You go on vacation with Ruthie and you're going to have a day planned, you know, a lot of different stuff. And they all want to know what we're doing today, what we're doing tomorrow, where we're eating today, where we're eating, all that kind of stuff. And I just, you know, you just got to go. But you do need to plan ahead, because otherwise you can be prepared, because you never know what could happen. Any one of us could fall down the step, and then what's going to happen? Prepare for your family and prepare for church. How could we improve as a church? So I think it's important, if we don't plan ahead, we're going to be in trouble. Notice remembering and pondering. I think it's interesting what happens then. Notice in verse 10. There's no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. If you remember, we saw that in Numbers 12, when God gets on to Miriam and gets on to Aaron, because, hey, I speak to them face to face, to Moses. How would you like to be Joshua? You're going to now take over, and no one ever since that time ever spoke with the Lord face to face. What does Paul tell us in 1 Corinthians 13? We look as in a mirror, dim, but then we will do what? Face to face. Moses was able to speak to God face to face. How would you like to replace him? I mean, you think about it, but God doesn't ask Joshua to be Moses. He gives him a second person, Eleazar. The two of them do the job. It may be two or three that does the job, or it takes two or three of you to do whatever job you're being led to do. When we think about it, so notice, no one's like him. Notice in verse 11, all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all of his servants, and all of his land, and for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all of Israel. They're remembering and pondering all those great things. And that was amazing. You think about all of them. You had 10 of the plagues. How many times were there miracles that Moses performed with the children of Israel that's recorded? There was 10. I'm sure there was others, but that's what's recorded. Think about it. How would you like to follow that? But that's what we need to remember. Remember for how great Moses was, but God does call each one of us home. And it's not easy to follow somebody who is a great leader like that. I'll never forget a statement. I've forgotten the man's name. In COVID, he was 96, still preaching up in Abilene, in the Dakotas, still speaking. And he was being used by Billy Graham's crusade at least 16 or 12, 16 different times. He led the evangelistic part of people to Christ, talking about leading the team. Just phenomenal man, and amazing how gifted he was in that. I'll never forget reading one thing that he said, or actually heard him speak, and he made this statement when it talks about applause and stuff, and people's accolades. He made this statement: taste it, but don't swallow it. How many people swallow it, and they think they're really something else? Acknowledge it, thank you, but God's grace, and move on. Jim Elliot made this statement: wherever you are, be all there. How many people are there, but they're not all there? They don't give 100%. Did Moses give 100%? You stop and think about it. What was Moses' greatest influence? What did he do while he was in the desert, in the wilderness, obviously, and they were there for 40 years? What did he write? How much influence has the first 5 books of the Old Testament had on humanity? How would you, if God says you can't enter and you're wandering around for 40 years, you look at our laws, and the laws of most civilized countries come based on what? This right here. First 5 books. I think it's interesting. Be all there. Do everything. Okay, I can't go in. You all can't go in. What can I do? How can I use my time? How many of those slaves do you think could write? God used his education in Egypt to know how to not only read, how to write, and he used it. Use what God's given him. What about C.T. Studd? Any of you ever looked at one? When I was a kid, if you didn't guess, I loved reading about all your great missionaries and great Christian athletes and so on. C.T. Studd was a remarkable man, considered one of the greatest cricket players ever to play, and he left and went to the mission field. And he made this particular statement. He wrote one about the chocolate soldier. You ever read one called The Chocolate Soldier? Talking about Christians, he said, yep, Christians, so many of them, when they get close to water, they dissolve. When they get close to the fire, they melt. And that would be true. A lot of Christians, they get close to some water, they're going to, they'll just dissolve. Any type of opposition. When Moses got next to opposition, he was neither one. He was purified. You stop and I think it's interesting. What about his prayer? Not Moses, but Paul's prayer, if you remember in Philippians chapter 3. And his whole prayer was, I haven't gotten there yet, but I want to know more of Christ, more intimate. So, is that really my prayer? So let's think about this. Moses' life. His main stuff comes down, I think, about 3 things. Involvement. How involved was he with people? He was involved as a shepherd. If you're a shepherd with sheep, you're going to be involved. Second one, how humble was he? Now that's amazing. You think about his abilities and what all God. Can you imagine today if somebody was meeting the Lord face to face and nobody else had? You think we might hear a little bit about it. And the third one is Moses' perspective. And we'll have to get the perspective next week, which is found in Hebrews 11. His perspective is amazing. So think about it. God called him home and called him home early because of sin. God hasn't called us home yet. We need to check, is there sin in my life? But what has he left me here for? Joshua had a purpose still to go. Caleb still had a purpose. We all have a purpose. What is it? But then be all there. Don't be a chocolate shoulder. I can assure you, you will get some heat. Don't melt.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.